The key had been in my pocket for 10 years, and my hand was shaking like it was the first time I'd ever held it. Downstairs, Ivy was still crying on my couch, mascara down her cheeks, a duffel bag by her feet that she'd packed in about 4 minutes flat. Upstairs, I was standing in front of a door I had promised my wife I would never open, not unless there was no other door left to open. I looked down the hallway. Every other room in this house was full of boxes, full of a broken guest bed, full of reasons. This was the only door left. I put the key in the lock. It turned easier than I expected, like it had been waiting. That's the part nobody tells you about a 10-year promise. It doesn't end with fireworks. It ends with a small click and your whole life changing shape. Nina used to say I fell in love with her stubbornness before I fell in love with her face. She wasn't wrong. She once returned a toaster to 3 different stores because she didn't like how the manager looked at her funny, and she won every single time. She left cabinet doors open like she was daring the house to argue with her. She sang off key on purpose, just to see if I'd wince. I always did. She always laughed. We lost a baby in our 2nd year of marriage. 14 weeks. Nina didn't talk about it for a long time, and when she finally did, she talked about it like weather. A storm that had passed through and left the yard different. I grieved loudly. She grieved quietly in the garden, pulling weeds that weren't there. We built a life around that quiet. Ivy came along through our son years later, and Nina loved that girl with an attention I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage. She noticed things about Ivy nobody else noticed. "That child collects doors," Nina told me once, when Ivy was 7, watching her line up dollhouse furniture into little rooms of her own design. "She needs somewhere that's only hers. Everyone does, eventually." I laughed it off. I didn't know I was supposed to remember it. Then came the diagnosis. Pancreatic. Fast, the way that one usually is. In her last 2 months, Nina spent whole afternoons upstairs in the spare room with the door shut, and when I asked what she was doing in there, she said, "Building something." I thought it was one of her projects. She always had one. I didn't ask again. That was my mistake, and also I'd learn exactly what she wanted. 3 days before she died, Nina pressed a brass key into my palm. It was the last rule she would ever leave me. "Don't open that door," she said, "until you have no other door left to open." I asked her what that meant. She just smiled, the way she did when she'd already won an argument I didn't know we were having. "You'll know," she said, "and it won't be for a long time. That's all right. I'm not in a hurry anymore." I promised. What else do you say to a dying woman? For 10 years, that door sat at the end of the hallway like a held breath. The first year, I almost broke it 100 times. Grief makes you reckless, makes you want to tear into anything that might still smell like her. I stood outside it once at 2 a.m. with the key already in the lock, and I don't know what stopped me, except that her voice was clearer that year than it's ever been since, and it said, "Not yet." The 4th year, my son and his wife split up, and Ivy, 12 then, stayed with me for a summer while things settled. She slept in the guest room. I remember standing in the hallway, looking at the locked door, thinking, surely this counts. It didn't feel right. I couldn't explain why. I let it go. The 7th year, a plumber flooded half the 2nd floor, and I genuinely considered the locked room as overflow storage, and I actually laughed out loud at myself in that empty hallway, because some promises you keep out of love, and some you keep because breaking them feels like erasing the person who asked. Somewhere around the 9th year, I noticed I'd stopped trying the handle at all. That scared me more than the wanting had. I'd assumed the promise would get easier because the grief would fade. Instead, the door just became furniture. A thing in the hallway I walked past the way you walk past a photograph you've stopped seeing. I wondered, some nights, if Nina had known that would happen too. if she'd built a test that only worked on a man who hadn't yet forgotten how to notice. Then, 3 weeks ago, my son called to say, Ivy, 17 now, sharper and more guarded than the little girl who used to build dollhouse rooms, needed somewhere else to be. I didn't ask for every detail. I didn't need them. I heard it in her voice when she called me herself, at 11 at night, asking if she could come stay for a while, maybe longer, Grandpa. Is that okay? I said yes before she finished the sentence. She arrived within the hour, and that's when I discovered the problem I hadn't planned for. Every room in my house had become something else. The guest room was a storage unit for a life lived alone. My son's old room hadn't had a working window in years. There was exactly one door left. Standing in that hallway with Ivy crying downstairs, I finally understood the shape of the sentence Nina had given me. Not until you have no other door left to open. She hadn't been talking about the house. She'd been talking about me. I turned the key. The room was small and warmer than it should have been, like it had been holding its breath along with me. A crib stood against the far wall. Unassembled pieces leaned neatly beside it. A rocking chair. A shelf of tiny folded clothes never worn, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed at the edges. My chest caved in. She'd built a nursery. 20 years after we lost that baby, she'd spent her last strength building the room our child never got to have. I felt something close to betrayal. We were supposed to have grieved that together. Instead, she carried it here, alone, in secret, for months I never knew about. I sat down on the floor of that room, the way I hadn't let myself sit down anywhere in years, and for a moment, I hated her a little, which is a strange thing to feel about someone you've missed every single day for a decade. I thought I had finally found the one piece of Nina she'd kept from me. I thought I understood the whole shape of the rule. Don't make her watch me grieve the baby all over again. Don't make her carry my sadness on top of her own. It was almost enough of an answer. It fit the door. It fit the key. It fit 10 years of silence. Then I saw the folded paper tucked into the crib rail, my name on it in her handwriting. You're standing in it and still asking the wrong question, it began, because of course it did. This was never a room for the baby we lost. It's a room for whoever needed it next. I didn't know her name yet when I built this. I know it now. Tell Ivy the rocking chair still works. I read it 3 times before the second meeting arrived, the way her arguments always did, quietly and then all at once. This wasn't a shrine. It had never been a shrine. Nina knew exactly who I was, a man who mistakes holding on for loving, who would have turned any memorial into a museum and moved in permanently. She hadn't built this room to preserve our grief. She'd built it so that grief would have somewhere to go besides me. She was betting that one day someone alive would need a door I hadn't yet closed with my own sorrow, and she trusted me to recognize the difference between keeping a promise and finally understanding one. She had watched a 7-year-old line up dollhouse rooms and understood something about Ivy that I hadn't. She didn't know what the future would bring. She only knew that one day someone I loved might need a door I had spent too long keeping closed. I carried the crib pieces down myself that night. Ivy helped me assemble the rocking chair, and we didn't talk about why there was a rocking chair in a room for a 17-year-old. She didn't need it for sleeping in. Not yet. Maybe not for years. But she sat in it anyway, and it held. I used to think the promise was about a door staying shut. It was never that. It was about a man learning, one slow year at a time, that love isn't the thing you lock away to keep safe. It's the thing you finally hand to someone who still has a whole life left to use it.